All right, guys. So today we're going to be talking about a few new topics, talking about the document object model, also known as the DOM. And then we're going to also incorporate JavaScript into our web pages so that we can actually do some cooler things. So let's kind of just dive right into it. Oops, that's not what we want. Sorry, I should not be at the end. We want to start at the beginning. All right, so HTML and JavaScript. This is going to be our front-end web development continuation for this week. Let's kind of review the pieces that we're using so far. So HTML, this is kind of what we've been focusing on for the last couple of days. This, I'm going to come up with like a small analogy here. This is our structure for our web pages, right? So we specify, hey, we want an image element here. We want a paragraph element here. We're just telling our browser how our page should be structured. So here, it's effectively the bones or our skeleton of our web page. All right, so we create the HTML document, and then we pass it to our browser. Our browser takes our skeleton and basically renders it or puts a nice skin around it. So we tell it how it should be structured. The browser's like, all right, cool, I'm going to actually render it and give you something that you can see. So that's what the browser does. That's the body. We're not doing anything in particular here. The browser takes care of all that processing and converting our HTML file into a rendered output in our browser. All right. So the third member of this this party, I guess, is CSS. So I know Raphael spent the last couple of days going over some nice CSS topics. I really like CSS. It's not really that thrilling to see like an empty web page. I kind of say like, in this analogy, if you just go out without any clothes on, well, people are going to probably be mad at you. The same thing, if you have a web page that's not styled, they're not going to like you very much. So they might throw things at you or at your web page if you don't have any nice styling to look at. So CSS in this case is the look and layout that we give to our web page. So without CSS, our HTML page can still work and do what we want, present content. We want to present our content in a nice and desirable way. So we add some CSS or some nice clothes to our, our body that's put onto the HTML page, or sorry, onto our browser, so that we can actually look nice and people won't yell at us. All right, so these are the three things we've been kind of focused on the last few days. Again, the browser isn't something we're doing; that's what we're working with. But now we're going to introduce a new member to the party, and that is going to be JavaScript. Why do we need JavaScript? Well, with HTML and CSS, we can create web pages, but these are quote unquote dumb web pages, meaning they don't really do much. They could present content, they could, allow some user interaction, but we're not really doing anything with our web pages if we just have HTML and CSS. JavaScript is the logic for our application. So this is the brains of our operation. Without JavaScript, again, our page is pretty static. It doesn't do much. It can show content, but it can't really interact with the user like we'd want to. But with JavaScript in the mix, we can actually make our page dynamic and react to user interaction using JavaScript. All right, so this is my little analogy here. Hopefully that kind of makes you understand each of the pieces we're using. So HTML is our structure, CSS is our look and layout, and then JavaScript, which we're going to be talking about today, is the brains or the logic of our application. Okay, so let's talk about, so I guess that's what I simply covered. We've been creating static web pages. So for a LinkedIn challenge, for example, we just presented content. We didn't really have much that we could do with it, but JavaScript makes it dynamic so that we could, again, respond to certain actions and, calculate whatever we want to. We could, present whatever data we want to using JavaScript. Okay, so let's kind of answer a question here though. How does JavaScript interact with an HTML document, right? We have an HTML file, and then we're going to be creating a separate JavaScript file. I guess we don't always have to, but essentially these are two different worlds, right? HTML is a markup language, JavaScript is a programming language. How do they communicate, right? So we have a markup language here on the left, and then a programming language here. They're wondering, hey, we want to work together, but how do we do it? The answer here is something called the DOM. So DOM stands for Document Object Model, and it kind of connects our HTML with our JavaScript so that they can kind of access one another. Usually it's your JavaScript that's going to be accessing your HTML document, but your HTML document is also going to call into your JavaScript logic, like you might call a function that you want to execute from your HTML page, and JavaScript will do the actual logic there. All right, so the DOM kind of sits in between your HTML file and your JavaScript file and presents some interface where both of them can kind of talk to each other. So as I mentioned, the DOM stands for Document Object Model. Important thing here, it's a representation of your HTML document in an object-oriented manner. So hopefully that term sounds familiar because we had OOP week a couple weeks ago. This is another example of object-oriented design where we just create a text file, right? When we write an HTML file, it's simply a text file, nothing really special about it aside from the formatting that we give to it. But our browser reads that text file or our HTML file, creates a render of what we're trying to display. It also creates this document object model, which is an object representation of all of the elements that we have in our HTML file. So that object is something that JavaScript can interact with. Your JavaScript is not like reading your HTML file saying, oh, cool, you have an image here. I'm going to somehow know how to interact with that. The DOM takes your image element. Let's say you have an image element in your HTML file, creates an object representation for that image element so that your JavaScript logic can interact with it. The DOM is structured as a tree. So again, if you're familiar with how our HTML documents form, we have a root node, which is our HTML element. Within that, we nest other nodes or other elements within them. Like we have a head section, we have a body section. Within our body section, that's where we put our main content. So we might have a heading. Within the heading, we might have a div. The div might have a nested paragraph or multiple paragraphs. Again, this is a tree, sorry, where we have parent nodes and child nodes and grandchildren nodes and so on, as many levels deep as we want to get to. All right, so as mentioned, this provides developers with the interface to interact with HTML documents. This is automatically done. This is nothing that we need to do. Your browser is taking care of creating the DOM. So we don't have to do anything special to get access to the DOM. Any questions about what the DOM is actually doing for us? Obviously, we're going to see some usage of the DOM in a second, but want to make sure we have a good understanding of why the DOM exists and how we are able to leverage it for our needs. All right. So as mentioned, the DOM is a tree structure. So we have our document, that's our HTML file. Our root element is the HTML element. That's what starts and ends our HTML document. But then we can have various levels of other elements. So as mentioned, head and body. The head section usually has a title. The body can have a whole list of different elements nested within one another. All right, so now that we understand that this DOM exists, we'll see it in play. But let's talk about JavaScript. How do we actually incorporate JavaScript with our HTML file? So there are two ways to do it. This is similar to how we use CSS, or we could write the CSS or the JavaScript internally meaning inside of our HTML file, or we can create an external JavaScript file and link that to our HTML file. I'd say the latter is usually the way we should be doing it, just kind of separate the worlds where we have HTML, logic, quote unquote logic, and then JavaScript logic in a separate file. All right, so we do it internally. We will add the script tag. So in our head section, we'll add a script tag, and then within our script tag, we could just write raw JavaScript. So let's actually see some examples because I assume it's more fun to see examples than not. So let's make a directory. Let's call this HTML.js, and let's code that up. All right, so I'm going to create a simple HTML document. I'm going to call it index.html. And let's create a quick HTML page. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of some extra stuff here for now. This is a bare bones HTML page. I have a head section that has a title. my title is my HTML page, and I have some various sections I might fill in later. But again, there's no content that's going to be shown right now. Let's add a header. So I'm going to add a header to my main section, say H1, hello world. All right, so just to kind of point out some things here, I have a nav section, a main section, and a footer section. These are just specialized HTML elements. For the most part, they're just glorified div tags. So I could simply use a div here. There's going to be no difference in the appearance if I use div or nav. The reason you might want to use nav, main, and footer is that if someone's kind of scraping your web page, they can kind of find the main content versus know what like the footer is or the navigation elements are. But again, these are glorified divs. You do not need to worry about what these actually are doing. They're just kind of sectioning off or labeling different parts of your HTML file. Any questions about our base HTML file here? Okay, hopefully this is all review. Okay, so let's take a look at what our web page looks like right now. I'm going to open it with live server. Should open up. Yep, there we go. So this is what our web page looks like. Again, just point out our title is in our tab. So whatever we had in our head section under title, my HTML page is the title I gave it. And then we have a nice header here using an H1 tag to show hello world. All right, so that's our web page right now. Nothing too exciting. But let's say we want to add some JavaScript. Like, for example, let's say I want to show an alert right when we load the page. Nothing too crazy there. Well, I could add JavaScript right into my HTML page, again, using the script tag. So opening script tag, closing script tag. The content between my script tags is going to be just JavaScript. So I could do an alert. That's a function that JavaScript can call. I could say, you've loaded the page. So the alert function will throw a pop-up, kind of a pop-up dialog on my browser. So one thing I do want to mention, I think I kind of skipped over it. We're going to be running JavaScript through our browser now. Previously, we were using Node, which was a terminal-based kind of engine for JavaScript. But now, instead of using Node, our browser will be the one actually executing our JavaScript and processing it. So this alert function is something that exists within our browser. It doesn't natively exist in our terminal. So we're executing our JavaScript via Node. This alert function would not exist. But since we're using it through our browser, we can call alert and safely assume that our browser will be able to handle that. All right, so if I add an alert, let's save this. Notice that I already got a pop-up, but let's refresh the page. Notice I get a pop-up saying you've loaded the page. All right, if I hit OK, it's going to continue loading the page there. Again, anything here can just be raw JavaScript. So if I want to create a variable, I could say let name equals Bill Gates, and then I could do an alert saying use that name value. So we'll do string interpolation. Again, any JavaScript that you're familiar with before, you can just kind of insert that here. So now we should see you've loaded the page and then see an alert using that name. So let's try again. Okay, so we've loaded the page. I hit OK. Notice we get Bill Gates as the second alert, and then we get to hello world. Was there a hand raised there, Brian?
Yeah, it was just me real quick. Can you? I don't know why you would necessarily ever want to do it, but can you also import like things that you would do import things in JavaScript in this type of situation too, or is this basically just limited to like kind of the core JavaScript functions?
That's a great question. What if we wanted to import something? I'm trying to think, are there any modules that we can import for JavaScript? I guess I'm familiar with Python, but let's try it.
Jquery, maybe.
What was that, Lyman?
Jquery, maybe. It's a popular.
Jquery. All right, let's Google that quickly. Import Jquery in JavaScript. So that's something we got to download, but so I guess the question is, can we use our normal like import something from something else? Usually we'll do that via script tags. So I'm gonna say maybe, but normally you want to use script tags to kind of include additional JavaScript logic. But right now we're just writing, again, raw JavaScript inside of our script tags. This
Thank
is, was there a comment there?
I was just saying thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so this will work. Obviously, we saw that our JavaScript kind of executing. Actually, right when we load the page, this executes right away. That's cool. It worked as we wanted to. But normally this isn't great practice. Usually I recommend keeping our world separate, right? So we have our HTML file. We should probably put JavaScript somewhere else, much like how we create a separate CSS file for our styling. We want to create a separate file for our logic of our application. So in this case, instead of doing this internally, I'm going to create an external file. Let's call it scripts.js. But again, we can name that anything that we desire. And now we can maybe move our logic that we had into this file. All right. And then now we want to tell our HTML file that we want to use that, or kind of import or include that JavaScript within our document here. So to do that, we use the src tag and we just point to the location. So I think it's the current folder, and then scripts.js is what I've called it. But let's go back to our slides. So src stands for source, and you just tell it what file you want to include. But notice in my slides here, I have this magic keyword called defer. Let's see what that actually does by first, let me make sure I have this correct. So scripts, what am I missing here? Oh, we need to end our script tag. All right, so now instead of having content between my script tag, I'm just telling it what the source is, and it's going to kind of auto load this logic, kind of like before. So if I run this again, nothing should have changed. If I refresh my page, notice I get, you've loaded the page, Bill Gates, nothing's changed. But what if I don't want to run this right away, right? Right now, our JavaScript file is basically being loaded and executed while our page is loading. What if I actually want to like maybe load my page first? So let's say I refresh, notice that there's no hello world here because our browser is going basically from top down and saying, all right, cool, I'm gonna load your JavaScript and execute that right away. It's not gotten to this line right here. As in my hello world has not been processed by my browser, so there's no display of that right here. But what if I don't want to run my JavaScript right away? Like let's say I want my page to load first and then for my JavaScript to execute rather than my JavaScript kind of executing before my page entirely loads. So to do that, we can use the defer keyword here. So adding this keyword to your script element will tell the browser to wait until the document has fully loaded, which can matter in certain cases, especially if you're trying to extract something off your document or off the DOM. You need everything to be created first before interacting with it through your JavaScript. So if we add this change, add defer here, this will tell our browser, hey, don't run this right away. Wait for everything else to kind of load in, and then we'll run our JavaScript. So it's not going to be too different right now, but if I refresh my page, I guess that still didn't do that. And I bet it's because, all right, so it's still running this file, but we want to maybe wrap this in window.onload. So once our page loads, this logic will execute. So let's try that again. Still not doing that. Defer. All right. I'm not sure why. We should see hello world here. So apologies for that. But let's actually
in your slide, it had the script tag. So yeah, see how it has the breaking point there? Is that would that do anything? I don't know.
No, so this is a self tag, but we could try that. So we could make this self-closing. I think that should be fine. Actually, I lied. Ignore my slides. Apparently, we need a separate closing tag. Okay.
I'll try.
I should probably change that here. So we don't want a self-closing tag. That works sometimes, but in this case, not for the script tag. Thank you for catching that. All right, so let's talk about this defer keyword in a little more detail, because obviously I'm not showing a good example here. But why do we need to do this? All right, these alerts are getting annoying also. So time to get rid of this. All right, so we could also do a console log. Those are less annoying. So let's just do a console log here. The page has loaded. So we do a console log. If we go to our property inspector, so I'm going to do Alt Command I for Chrome. Notice I have some message in my console. So if I refresh, that's what's still in my console. But again, I know I haven't done a good job talking about what the deferred keyword's doing. So let's actually explore that with my next slide here. So how do we access elements from the DOM using JavaScript? There's a reserved keyword called document, which refers to the DOM. Again, this is not something we had to create ourselves. This is automatically accessible through our JavaScript. And then there are a few handy methods that allow us to actually grab elements from our DOM and use them as we wish. So for example, get element by ID will investigate the ID attribute and search through our DOM, find an element that has a particular ID and return that object to us. So if I can kind of extend my example here, let's actually give an ID to my header. Let's say ID is going to be welcome. So now I can identify this particular element if I want to access it in my JavaScript. So let's actually get it. So here I'm going to create a variable called, let's say, welcome header, and we'll do document.get elements by ID. Again, this document object exists already. I'm not importing anything. I'm not creating anything. I just have access to it kind of automatically. Get element by ID is a method that exists on the document, and I can pass that an ID. So in this case, I'm going to pass it welcome. Again, this is the name that I gave to my element here. Maybe I could do split screen if that makes it a little easier. All right, so my index.html on the left side here, I've given it this element an ID, and if that allows me to access that element here. So this welcome header is an object representation of this header. And now I can manipulate the values that exist for this element. For example, one property for an element, I could do welcome header.innerhtml. Innerhtml refers to whatever is between the opening and closing tag here. So here I could set, goodbye world. All right, so instead of having hello world, I can manipulate the content there by setting the innerhtml here to be goodbye world. So let's take a look at this and see what happens. So notice when I load this page, it just says goodbye world. Now, what if I didn't have that deferred keyword? I know that's the question we had before. If I don't have this defer, I might run into some issues here. So if this item doesn't exist, let's actually just have it like this. All right, so if this, if I try to access my code kind of immediately here, it's going to try to find an element called welcome. However, welcome will not have been created at this point in time, meaning our script loads, it's going to try to run this. Let's see what happens here. Notice I get an error in my console. Uncat type error cannot set properties of null because we got a null value back here, right? Because this element does not yet exist. Now, the question is, if we add defer, hopefully this will do what I want. Will this work? Yeah, so notice now I'm not getting that error because this defer keyword says, wait for everything here to load before kind of running this code. And the difference here is now this welcome, this element with an ID of welcome has been created since the loading of this was deferred. So now I'm actually able to access the element and do whatever I want with it. Sean, did you have a question?
Yeah, so do you have to put it in the head, like the script? What if you put the script after like H1?
Yep. Good comment. Great comment. I definitely don't want to kind of deceive you guys. You don't always have to put the script tag in the header. Usually this is a good location for it because this is kind of where your page resources or meta items are kind of stored. I prefer to just kind of have everything up here, but you can actually put the script tag at the very bottom So I can do this at the very end of my body section, and that now we'll no longer need the defer keyword. So yeah, script tag can exist in your body. I guess that's something I should have clarified. It doesn't have to be in your head section. So if I do it this way without the defer keyword, still should work because all of my elements will be created. And the very last thing that happens in my body section would be the script loads. So if I did it this way and refresh, I should not see any errors. Notice I have goodbye world and no errors down here. Excellent question though. Thank you, Sean. Andrew, question?
Something on a similar line of thinking. When you put defer, at what point does it start? Does it start after the body ends or after HTML document ends?
Good question. I'm not going to say I know 100%, but I believe it's after the body loads, the body section loads. So I'm not sure there's a good way to check for that, but it's within our HTML document, so it should happen before our HTML document completes. But yeah, it's a good question. Sorry for my fuzziness there. I believe it's after your body loads, but it might be your entire document. John Winko?
Yeah, for the error when you don't have defer in, for whatever reason, I'm not getting the issue whenever I leave the defer out. I'm just wondering if there's somewhere within Chrome's dev tools to look at errors aside from just the console.
So question for you, are you seeing what you expect on the web page, or are you seeing hello world, or are you seeing goodbye world?
I'm seeing goodbye world.
It could be, so if you added it in your onload method, let's see if this makes a difference.
So I did the same thing as you with an onload, and the interior was set in welcome header and a change in the Innerhtml for welcome header.
So let's see. So there's this, your window has an onload method that we can kind of override. So here we're saying when the window loads, let's do something. Let's see if this makes a difference. So I'm going to move my script tag back to the top without the defer. Let's see if this works. So go here, refresh. Yeah, so if you have an onload method, this method will only fire once your entire document loads. So that's, again, in this case, I don't have my defer, but that's okay because this function will only be called when my page loads. Without this function, this logic is going to execute when my JavaScript file is kind of brought into the mix. Okay, so again, there's different ways to load in your JavaScript. I prefer to put in my head section and just saying defer. You can put it at the very bottom of your body section, and it should work the same. Okay, so that's what the defer keyword is for. Sorry for maybe confusing you guys earlier. Courtney, you have a question?
I was just reading it on something, and the way that you're teaching us makes more sense because it allows it to load sooner, is what Stack Overflow says, and it has like a ton of checks. So
gotcha. There's
what
also
you're doing is the best way.
There's also a async keyword. So this tells your browser to load this kind of in parallel. I don't really use this as much, but there might be certain use cases for this. So just know that you can add async, which means load the JavaScript while you're loading the document. Defer says load the JavaScript after you load the document. Again, there might be different use cases. It doesn't make much sense to do async defer. In fact, if you Google this, because I've done it before, it tells you that this is kind of redundant in certain ways. Async, I could spell async. But yeah, usually you'll see one or the other, or yes, neither. But I think defer is the preferred way, in my humble opinion. You might see other arguments elsewhere. But thank you, Courtney, for looking that up. All right, so hopefully that clarifies what defer keyword does. Again, sorry for any confusion earlier. But let's talk more about these fancy methods. Again, these are the main methods for accessing things from your HTML page through the DOM and kind of manipulating elements with JavaScript. So if you actually, I'm going to borrow some code from our curriculum page in case you're following along. But let's actually see some of these methods in play. So I'm going to copy some base HTML that we have. So let's go with, all right. So I'm going to kind of shelve my example here. It's not the best example. I'm going to copy in what we have on our curriculum page. And so this is what we have. We have a head section, which again has a title, has the loading of the script. And now we have our body that has, looks like an input, a button, and a div with a paragraph in it. So let's kind of separate these out. So an input element, this is another HTML element that we can have on our page. This allows the user to enter in some text. We have a button that has something called onClick. This is an event attribute, which effectively is going to say, if you click on the button, call this function for me. So it's not going to call this function immediately, but when a click event happens, the onClick event attribute is going to kind of get triggered, and whatever value we have here, in this case, it's a function that we're calling, that's going to be called. Now, where's this function living? In this case, it's not in our HTML document. We need to add that to our JavaScript. So I'm going to, again, just copy it from our curriculum page to save some time here. But here, I'm going to create a function. Let's put this this. But now I've created a function. Notice we're using our fat arrow syntax, and I'm doing some work here. So when this button is clicked, we're going to call our function. The semicolon's optional. Show greeting is the name of the function, so that's matching the name of the function I gave it here. And then we're going to proceed to do some things here. So in our function, we're going to call document get element by ID. We're going to pass it an ID name of input-name. Again, notice that matches exactly the ID of our input. The naming does matter. Again, can be really fragile. If you make a typo, it's not going to work how you want it to. But in this case, we're saying, hey, let's get this element from our DOM or from our document, and that's going to be something we can interact with. Additionally, we're going to get our greeting output. So we're going to do another call, get element by ID, name output. So that's going to be targeting this paragraph right here. Currently, this paragraph has nothing in it, right? There's no content here. But we're going to actually add content for our output element here. So notice we check. This is also important because there's no guarantee that the element that you are looking for will exist in your document. Hopefully it should, since you're the one creating this logic. But here, I'm simply checking if these objects are actually not null. So I'm saying if name input is not null and greeting output is not null, then proceed to actually do something there. Otherwise, I would get an error if I didn't actually have those elements present on my page. So here I'm setting the inner HTML and saying, all right, if the user enters their name in here, I'm going to greet them with a message saying hello and getting the name out of the elements. So take a look at what our web page looks like with this new code. So we have an input field right here, and we have a submit button. Nothing too crazy going on here, but if I type in Bill Gates, when I click this button, again, that click event is going to be handled right here. It's going to say, all right, when the onClick event happens, go on and call this function in your JavaScript project. So this function will be executed only when the click event happens, not immediately when the JavaScript loads or when your document loads, only when the click happens. So if I actually click this, notice we get a nice message here saying, hello, Bill Gates. I want to definitely pause here, make sure we understand what's going on in the logic here. Let's kind of space this out. So again, get element by ID. This is a function that exists on your document, nothing that we've created. And this lets us access elements by ID value or ID attribute. So usually good practice to give all of your elements IDs. In theory, or I guess in my theory, I don't give everything an ID unless I know I need to interact with it. For example, my button here has no ID that I've given it. That's fine because I don't need to kind of refer to my button in my JavaScript code. But other developers might say maybe everything should have an ID. I'll kind of leave it to you what you think is best practice. Elon, do you have a question?
Yes, this is a very quick question. So when you in your last if statement, when you say hello name input.value, why you use name input.value instead of just name input variable?
Yeah, so a lot of this is just kind of stuff that I'm kind of dropping in front of you and not probably showing you where it's coming from, but value is a property on an input element. So again, reading documentation is kind of half the battle for a lot of stuff that we're learning here. So if actually, want to Google it, we can do it like input elements. And that should take us to, let's go to W3 schools. So the input tag, if we look at down below, these are all the attributes that we have access to for the input element. There's an accept attribute, there's checked, again, a whole bunch that most of these I've not even used. If you scroll down, notice there's a value attribute for input elements. Again, this doesn't exist for every element out there. So for example, if I had a button element, I can't just call dot value on it. I might need to call something else, but again, this says this is text, specifies the value of an input element. So again, this is something that I kind of just know because I've used input elements before, but if you're kind of like wondering, well, how do I actually get, the text from an input element or from a button or from a div? Well, again, half the battle is going to be, all right, go to your documentation, look at examples and kind of try to figure out which attribute you need to actually refer to. So in this case, dot value gives us that input, whatever the user input into that input element.
Also a follow-on question. So is that means whenever you trying to refer to a variable you created, it's not always directly grab the exact like a data type that you're referring to. So you somehow you gotta use some method to achieve that data type.
Sorry, you kind of lost me with that question. Could you clarify? I don't know if pointing to code might be a little easier.
Like in this scenario, the name input is supposed to be like a string.
This
So
or this?
the first one, like when you first initiate it.
Yes. So important thing here, this is an object representing this entire element. So again, this is what the DOM is doing. So my HTML file just is purely text. There's nothing special about it. But the browser reads my file in, says, all right, I'm going to create an input element for your web page. So my browser created this for me. I obviously didn't create any rendering here. But additionally, the DOM that kind of exists between my HTML file and JavaScript, that gets created by the browser. And that says, all right, we're going to create an object representation of this input field so that you can actually access things like dot value. I could access dot ID here if I wanted to. So the ID here would be input name. I can also do dot placeholder. So we could do that just for fun. But yeah, anything that, the attributes within my inputs tag, I have access to with this object. So if you kind of want to imagine, we create an instance of an input class, if that's kind of how you want to imagine it. And this instance has properties or attributes that we can access.
Okay, thank you. I think I was just confused about it for some reason.
Okay, are you good? I want to make
Yeah,
sure
I'm good. Thanks so
I can't
much.
confuse you anymore, not answer your question. All right, cool. Thank you for that question. Andrew Tran.
So going off what you just said, if you have print name input, will it show object at this memory location right afterwards?
Yep. So I won't do the memory location, but we do a console log since we're in JavaScript. But yeah, we can actually see what this looks like. We can see what this object looks like. And your browser console actually gives you a nice representation for it. So let's actually run this and see what our console gives. So let's type in Bill Gates, hit submit. So notice what we get down here. This is the actual object that we're dealing with. Yep. All right. Any other questions about what we've kind of copied and pasted here? So again, make sure you understand how we are referring to this function. Again, that is through an events attribute. In this case, we chose to kind of hijack the onClick and respond to a click event using our show greeting function. Okay, let's actually extend. Oh, Andrew, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm just getting a little lost. What's greeting output? It's the object of the PID equals output.
Greeting output right here. Yeah, so
Yeah.
again, I'm targeting this element. So I said get element by ID and look for an ID of output. So I've chose to give this element the ID value of output. So again, this is just a naming thing that I did. I can name this whatever I want, but if I want to access this element, I will do it by ID because that's a identifier and say, all right, give me the element that has that ID. So right now it's a paragraph with nothing in it. I'm taking that paragraph tag, so greeting output. If you want to make it more clear, let's say output paragraph element. Maybe that's a better naming of my variables. But again, this is just the paragraph element, and I'm saying update the Innerhtml. So everything between the tag right here, that's what I'm inserting with this stuff here.
Oh, okay. I've got it.
So I put a comment here. I don't know if we talk about comments in HTML, but that's exclamation dash dash inner HTML goes here. Jesse.
Yes, I had a question on your document.get element by and your .inner HTML in the GS. Is there like a cheat sheet that we can look off of in the future,
Um,
or a particular document that you recommend for us to look at?
yeah, so we have, if you go through the curriculum page, there are a bunch of links that we've provided. I'll pull some up on our screen because they're definitely good to see. Let's see if I can find it. Yeah, I think this is the page I want. All right, so I'm gonna, yeah, again, good to see some documentation. So if you search for HTML DOM documents, this will kind of give you access to what the document has, the document or the DOM object has access to. So notice there's get element by ID. There's a whole list of them. We're not going to go over, most of these, but the main ones for accessing elements are these four here. So get element by ID, class name, name, that's deprecated, so I guess we won't focus on that, but tag name. So we'll see an example of using these in a moment. But yeah, again, you can just search for DOM or document objects, and that should give you, W3 schools, or MDN is a good resource too. So yeah, there's plenty of resources out there, documents here. So again, get comfortable with reading documentation. Hopefully you kind of understand how to find the data you want. But again, it has access to a lot of properties, document children. Again, I'm not going to go through all these because honestly, I've not used most of them. But the ones we kind of highlighted here are going to be your most used methods. In terms of the elements, we could quickly Google that. But again, you guys should be good with your Googling skills also. Objects, HTML. Is that what I want?
Yeah, I was trying to see where you got the .inner HTML piece. So
Gotcha. So if you search for elements, so these are all elements, whether it's a paragraph element or a div element, you can look up the elements documentation. And then again, there's a whole list of them. But let's see, we're doing inner HTML. So inner HTML is one property we could set. So element.inner HTML, it's gets to set the HTML markup contained within the elements. I think there's a corresponding one that's similar. It's inner text, I think, is one of them. Sorry, I got to go through this documentation here. But yeah, so again, there's a lot of them. I don't know what all these area ones do, but yeah, you can discover some other things you can do.
okay, so basically the main thing is element is the keyword to look into on the HTML pieces.
Yeah, so elements is just like a generic term. So again, all of these are elements. This is a button element. This is an input element. This is a div element. So all elements have the same properties. So again, this goes back to our OOP discussion. These are all elements, so they all share some properties. One example is inner HTML. All of these will also have IDs. So regardless of what type of element I have, I should have access to a .id property if I want it. But certain elements have additional properties. For example, we saw for the input element, we have a .value that we can access. I don't think we'd be able to do a .value for button because that's not a property that exists for the button element. It only exists for the input element. So that's, again, an example of inheritance where all of them share some base functionality. They are all elements, and elements are granted the same properties. So again, all of these things are accessible for any element you deal with. But then there are more specialized elements. So again, if I do like button elements, see if that gives me, yep. So the button elements has some additional things that other elements might not have. So it looks like there's, a disabled property that's going to be, you could disable a button, but you might not be able to disable like a paragraph. Because the paragraph is kind of, not really interactable. All right, cool.
Thank you. Yep.
Any other questions? Yeah, thank you for your question, Justin. Any other questions here?
Yeah, I have a question.
Go for it, John.
So I typed up what you had, and it works when you run it in live server, but I ran it in the when you run Python -m http.server, and it didn't work. So I didn't know if there was like a major difference between that.
Well, keep in mind we shouldn't be using Python because it's JavaScript. If you want to run this in your terminal, this is not going to work because that's using Node. That has no knowledge of your HTML document, right? So our browser is the one loading our HTML document, and within that, it's loading JavaScript that's connected to it. If you ran this, again, kind of externally with Node, it's not going to know what document is. Document is specifically for your browser. Node is a separate kind of engine that runs in your terminal. Document means nothing to Node. It's going to be like Node or document doesn't exist. Like, what are you trying to do here? I don't know what specific area you might have gotten, John. But yeah,
Yeah, it wasn't just an error, it just didn't run at all.
okay. But you're using Python, you said, right?
Yeah, like we were like Raphael showed us, you do like Python and then like TACM and then HTTP dot server, and it brings up a server of your code, I guess.
Okay,
your
sorry.
HTML.
Yeah, apologies. I guess I'm not familiar with that particular method. But yeah, maybe Raphael would know how if you message in the questions channel. But okay, so we kind of saw how we can access an element by ID. There are other ways to access elements within our page, but I think we are probably due for a break here. So let's put that on pause. All right, so let's continue here. But before we continue, any questions about the document? Does everyone kind of understand what the document's representing? Just to review, so that document keyword is an object that already exists for us to use in our JavaScript file that's created by the browser, and that's what our DOM is, our DOM, document object model. That's how we can access our HTML page through this document object. Andrew Tran?
Yeah, the ones that you were getting, so you were getting objects by their ID.
Yep.
Are those objects being created even before you ask the document to get element ID? Like, it's already there as an object?
Correct. Yes, the document contains all these objects already. It's not getting created when I call get element by ID. It exists. It's just returning that object to me, and I'm grabbing it and doing whatever I want with it.
And you're saying like everything inside of the objects, like the nested child, is like kind of like how we did like for object oriented programming. It's like they're like holding that object inside of that object.
Yeah. So each of these nodes. So if we look at our coding example, like we have parent-child relationships. So this body element is going to have some way to access all its children, because again, this is a hierarchy. This is a tree. So there's a children. I believe there's a children property for all elements that will give you a list of all their children. So in this case, body would have input, button, and div as children elements, but then div itself would have another level. It would have its own children, in this case, one paragraph element. Yeah, so this is all created by your browser automatically right from the start. So it's not going to be, kind of when you request it. It's available for you to use when you need it. Cool. All right, so continuing on from our curriculum page, just going to grab some examples again, so we don't have to write too much more code. But let's actually take a look at some of these methods. So I'm going to add some more code into our page. Again, I'm just grabbing this from our curriculum page in case you are wondering where it's coming from. But added some buttons and then added some divs here. So let's make room for that. I'm expanding my terminal. All right, so we had our input button up here, our output, that's still going to remain, not going to use it for now. But I added a couple new buttons and I added some new divs here. It looks like I forgot to copy ending div, or did I just not have that? Yep, shame on me. Yeah, the curriculum page is missing a closing div. But hopefully you guys spotted that with your good eyes for HTML. But here, let's take a look at what we have. We have a parent div, which I've aptly named parent div. So that's the ID I gave it. Again, this is not a special name. This is just what I've chosen to name it. Within the parent div, I have three separate divs. I have the first one, which I've given ID 1, the second one, which has ID 2, and the third one, which is ID 3. Additionally, I've chosen kind of some random classes to apply to it. So in this case, I have a class name of Alpha and Apple. Again, you can apply multiple classes to a single element. So this one has Alpha and Apple. This one has Alpha and Avocado. The third div is of class Beta and Banana. Kind of some weird sounding names, but hopefully you guys can jive with it. All right, so I've added a new function call here, but again, this is not going to work automatically. I need to add the logic because update color right now does not exist in my JavaScript file, right? My only thing I have right now is the show greeting function. So I need to add in the function that I'm trying to call. So the first function version I'm going to add in is going to use get element by ID, which we just saw here. So if we want to focus on this, again, get element by ID, you call that off the document object, and then you pass it the ID of the element that you want. So in this case, I'm calling first. No, that's wrong. That should be 1 because I want to get this div here. Probably should edit this page before I forget. But yeah, so I want to get this div right here. So what I've highlighted here is what's going to be returned. And I'm storing that as a variable called e for element, not the most descriptive name, but obviously don't want to type as much. So I think that should be fine. Any questions on our new change here? Okay, so again, this will give us the first item with an ID of 1. Now, this is important in that you could have multiple elements that have the same ID. For example, if I want to name my second div 1 also, this is fine in the sense that your page is not going to crash. Nothing bad inherently is going to happen, but this is bad practice. You should almost never have the same ID on a given page repeated more than once. So again, IDs should be unique identifiers. Therefore, you should not be reusing them between each other. That's different than classes. Classes obviously are totally fine to be reused. So in this case, I can have alpha used between my first div and second one. But again, IDs should be unique so that when you use the method get element by ID, you for sure know what you're referring to. Now, in this example, like right here, if I did have 2 IDs, again, this is not going to crash or do anything inherently wrong. But now get element by ID is going to return the first element that has that ID. So it's expecting one element should have an ID. If you have multiple elements that have the same ID, well, that's fine. Only the first one that the document encounters is what's going to be returned in that case. All right, but again, just as good practice, don't reuse IDs within your page unless you have some reason that you want to. A good reason. But again, usually I've not encountered reusing IDs. All right, so what am I doing here? I am checking to make sure that the element actually exists because there's no guarantee that anything on the page has an ID of 1. It's always good practice to make sure you check before you're actually using an object. So in this case, I want to check if this is not null. If that is not null, in this case, I'm going to update the color. So I'm doing e.style, which accesses the CSS styling. I'm going to set the color property. So again, if you remember your CSS properties, color is one of them. You can set background color. You could set font width or font weight. You set a whole list of things that you want. Edgar, I think you had a question that you might want to ask.
Yeah, I had 2. So one was if you do have multiple, like with ID 1, would there be any way to access the second one?
Not directly. You can indirectly access it. For example, I could go get the parent div element and say, give me all your children. And then if I know it's the second div, I could access the second child that way, but I can't do it through the ID. So again, if the ID is repeated, I don't think there's any way that I know of to kind of say, all right, give me the second element that's like.
Okay. And then my second question is, you can access the style of the element. Is there anything else you can access?
Yep. Again, there's a whole list of items you can access. So I'm going to go back to our documentation page. Sorry, it was element HTML. That should get me what I want. HTML elements reference. Oh, I don't know why this is looking terrible. Something went wrong. Can I refresh? All right, cool. Something went wrong with the styling there, but yeah. So let's see. We have an HTML elements reference. Let's click on this. Yeah, element. So here, that's all I want. Sorry, it's not always the easiest to navigate through all this stuff. This is not what I want. Let's say elements objects. DOM element object. All right, cool. So all of these methods are available to you for any element. You could do, let's see, children, I think is one of them. There's a first child. So if you want to get the very first child of element, that's accessible to you. Again, ID, Innerhtml, these are things we talked about before. So Style should be listed here too. So if I scroll down, notice style is one of many things I can access out the element. So style sets returns the style attribute. But if I wanted to set, I'm trying to think of something that might make sense. There's so many of these. Again, I could update the last child. So let's say I want to remove a child from the DOM. I could say, give me your last child. Let me just chop it off the DOM. That's something that might happen. But yeah, a lot of these, again, I've not used myself, but there's a whole list of things you can get access to. But style is probably one of the more popular ones because you want to kind of affect the look of something. So here, my function, notice it's taking a parameter this time. Our show greeting function didn't take a parameter because we didn't want to pass it something. In this case, I do want to pass it a value. In this case, I'm going to accept a parameter called and name it color. I'm going to use that to set the actual color of this element. So if we look at our code here, maybe I should make this a little smaller. Update color is the function. Notice I'm passing a parameter manually here. So here I'm passing a color code. The second button that's called blue is passing a different color code, but I'm calling the same function in either case with a different parameter for the red button and the blue button. And then that's going to change one or more of these divs based on the method I'm using. So in this case, I'm using get element by ID. So if I click the red or blue button, it should only change the color of this div because that is the only div that I access with get element by ID. So let's take a look at this with this update color version in here. So if I go here, notice I have my red and blue buttons. I have 3 divs here. Only the first div should be targeted when I click these buttons because that's how I chose to access the element. So I click red. Notice that only the first div changes to red. If I click blue, well, this is blue now. Again, this is get element by ID. What if we want to extend this a little bit? So maybe instead of doing get element by ID, what if I want to do something a little different? That should be fine. So instead of using get element by ID, I'm now going to use get element by class name. So I'm going to copy some code, replace this function with a new version that uses get elements. Again, key emphasis on elements. This is plural, meaning that this method is going to return you one or more elements to you. And this is by class name, because as we talked about, more than one element can use the same class. That's the whole purpose of classes, kind of reuse some styling or some functionality. So here, my first div and my second div have the class of alpha. My third div does not. My third div is beta and banana. So it's not going to be matched by me requesting elements that have the alpha class. So I get an array back. This is going to be an array of objects. And I could do a for loop over the array and set the color for every element. So again, LMs is an array of objects or array of elements. And I'm just going to go through each element one by one, update the color, similar to what I was doing before. So now in this case, since I'm using get elements by class name, both of these divs right here should be updated in terms of their color because they both have this alpha class that I'm targeting. So if I ran this, this should be good to go. Notice when I click the buttons now, both my first and second div are updating because they both have the same class, and I chose to access my elements by class name. Any questions on using get elements by class name? All right, let's see if I enter a name here, Bill Gates, like we did before. That functionality should still exist. Hello, Bill Gates. Nothing too crazy going on there. But now I'm going to use another getter method. So instead of using get elements by class name, what if I want to target by tag name? Meaning a tag of div means every single div on my page will be updated. This again, the ID doesn't matter, the class name doesn't matter. I'm saying anything that's a div on my page, I want to update every single div element. So in this case, I use get elements by tag name. Again, elements plural, meaning this is going to return an array. And then I could go through that array and again, set the style based on my desires. So again, keep in mind, this is every single div, meaning this div here, this div here, this div here, but also our div up here, that's still a generic div. Like there's nothing differentiating this div from this div. They're all just divs. So now I could go here. If I click red, notice all 3 of my divs here. And if I typed in Bill Gates here, this div that gets, that has a paragraph within it, that is also red. or blue, whatever color you prefer. But this is, again, targeting by the tag type. Any questions on get element by ID, get elements by class name, or get elements by tag name? Marcos, you have a question?
Yeah, if you had a paragraph tag inside of one of the div elements, would it inherit the color?
Yeah, so this goes more into like CSS functionality, but certain properties are automatically inherited. So for example, we saw that right here where I have my output paragraph, which is nested within my div.
Okay.
And notice I only set the color for the div, but that kind of trickles down to my paragraph because my paragraph doesn't have anything that it's specifying. So yeah, certain attributes or certain CSS styles automatically get propagated to their children, but others do not. It's kind of, again, you just kind of got to know which ones do and which ones don't. A lot of font properties automatically get passed down, but layout properties and like other properties don't always go down to the child. It's more just, yeah, it's part of just kind of working with it and kind of understanding which ones do and don't. But again, documentation can also tell you that. If you're kind of curious, like, hey, does this property trickle down? You could test it out, or you could, search the web and say, hey, does CSS property XYZ get inherited automatically? But yeah, good question. Okay, so there are a couple other ways we can access elements. These methods have some limitations, right? For example, I'm using div, right? That's going to target every single div. What if I like wanted to ignore this div, for example? I can't really do that easily with get elements by tag name. Yes, I could target by ID individually, like if I only want these three. I could do it by class name. I guess that's one way if I set a class on these three. So again, these methods are pretty flexible, but not as flexible as we necessarily may need it. So another couple methods that exists, and these are more tied to CSS selectors. So I'm going to copy another version of this. There's a function called Query Selector. Now this particular method is very, very, very similar to get element by ID. The only key difference is that you are using a CSS selector, not an HTML attribute. So if you remember from our CSS introduction, the way you access an element by ID is using the hashtag and then the name or the ID of the element. So here, if I want to target this div using query selector, I would have to use hashtag and then the ID I want to target. So this would do the same thing as if I were using get element by ID. And just to prove that, let's go back to our page. Notice when I click red and blue, that's only affecting this element because I've targeted that by the CSS selector. There's also query selector all, which is similar to get elements by class name or by tag name, but it's a little more flexible. So again, there are use cases for using query selector over using get element by whatever. So query selector here, again, keep in mind you need to select it by CSS using CSS selector syntax. So here for classes, we use dot, right? So if I want to target the alpha class, right? I have alpha class that's, on some elements. I would use query selector all. Dot refers to a class, and then alpha is the name of the class. That's going to return an array of elements, just like, get elements by class name or get elements by tag name. And then I could iterate over those elements and update whatever I want. So in this case, only 2 of these have the alpha class. So I can, update the first 2 divs. But the thing that query selector all can do that, get elements by class name cannot do is you can target multiple classes. So for example, if I don't want to just target .alpha, let's say I want to target also .apple, meaning I want something that's only alpha and apple. I believe that's what this should be doing. Let's actually verify that. Oh, so it's going to be targeting either or. So let's add banana. Banana. So here it's going to say find something that has class name alpha or class name banana. So in this case, these 2 have alpha. The third one has banana, so that should be fine. I could target multiple classes, and that did not work, so I am ashamed. But query selector all, let's actually read documentation since I am struggling here. Query selector all. Let's take a look. So going to MDN, query selector all, selectors. It looks like that probably needs to be an array. Let's see. Nope, we hit comma separated list. Okay, so I need one string with a comma separated list, it looks like. So sorry about that. So not two parameters. I need one string with a comma in it. So this would say either something that has alpha or banana. So let's try that. Okay, there we go. So notice that the third div is part of the party now because it has class name banana. Again, if we're familiar with our combinators from CSS, this is something we should have gone over, but you can combine classes. This is going to say anything that is both class alpha and class banana. In this case, none of these candidates apply, right? Because this is class alpha, but it has no class banana. So if I try to do this, nothing should happen. But what if I did alpha and avocado? Avocado. This should target this one because this is the only element that has both classes of alpha and avocado. So I think if I've done this correctly, only the second div should be modified by this function now. Hopefully I'm not lying to you. There we go. So notice only the second div hits the selector. So query selector gives you more control where you can kind of combine classes. You can even combine, again, hopefully this was covered with our CSS introduction, but you can combine ID selectors and class selectors. So for example, let's say I want to do something like alpha and 2. So this will say only something with an ID of 2 that has alpha as a class. Now, it doesn't make too much sense because ID should be unique enough. But let's say in this example, let me change this up again. This is bad practice. Please be clear on this. But I'm gonna choose to use the same ID here. ID 1 and 1. Again, we talked about this. You don't want duplicate IDs. For this example, I'm going to say apple and 1. This is saying find an element that has an ID of 1 and a class of apple. So in this case, it's going to know how to choose between this one and this one. So because I've specified exactly what to target. So if I do this, notice the first one changes. If I change this to avocado, again, bad practice. I want to make sure this is clear for anyone that's following along here. You should not use the same ID twice. But I'm just showing you an example here where you can target specifically using query selector all. In this case, we have 2 IDs that are duplicated, but we can still target it based on the class and ID kind of in conjunction. So now that I've changed it to 1.avocado, the query selector should know I'm trying to target this div instead of the first div, even though both have the same ID. So I go back here, notice that now my second div is the one that's targeted by query selector all. I feel like I was talking a lot there, so let me pause. Any questions on any of the methods we just talked about? Again, query selector all and query selector are a little more flexible because they target CSS selectors, which can be kind of combined and do some of the more advanced stuff that we can't just do with get element by ID or get element by class name. Let me change this before I get yelled at. Any questions? Okay, so we've talked about accessing elements. Jesse, you have a question.
Yes, just to reiterate, or the document that get elements by all, we cannot add more than one class in there.
Yep, so if I did get elements by class name, you're limited to one class only here. There's no way to say get alpha and apple together. That is a limitation of get elements by class name. It's a single class name, not multiple class names.
All right, thank you.
Yep, so that's why you might want to use query selector all should you need that functionality. All right, so we talked about accessing elements, right? We saw some great methods to access elements, but what if we want to create new elements? These methods are used for elements that already exist in our initial HTML document, but we do have the ability to create new elements dynamically using JavaScript. So again, we'll use the document object. Then there's this method called create elements that can create a brand new element for us. And then we could attach it to the DOM if we want to. So I'm going to add some code here. Again, just to expedite things, but I'm going to add a new function to my JavaScript logic. And that's going to be called insert new elements. I guess I probably don't want to delete all of my previous code because that's going to be an error. Okay, so I created this new function. Again, if there's any questions on the code that I'm pasting in, please ask, because I want to make sure everyone's comfortable. But here, my new function is going to call that new method that we just talked about. So I call document.create element, and I pass it the type of element I want to create. So here I'm saying create a new div element. I could create any type of HTML element that I want. I can even create my own custom elements if I want to. Like I create a donuts element if I want to. Like there's nothing stopping me. It's the same thing if I wrote donuts here and I created a donut element. Obviously that has no real meaning, but I could create a donut element and use that however I want to. But in this case, I'm going to create a div because we're more familiar with divs. So I create a new element and store that in a variable, and then I can set whatever properties I want. For example, Innerhtml, I'm going to set, hey, this is a newly created div. Also, you can set the class name. So one important thing here, you don't want to call .class. Class is a reserved keyword. So to actually set the class name, you got to go through the class name property in JavaScript. But in this case, I'm going to give it two classes, alpha as one class and added as another class. Important thing here, the stuff I've highlighted right here, this is creating a new element. But this element right now is just floating off in space. It has no relationship to our HTML document right now. So this is an important thing. It's easy to forget. But once you create an element, you need to somehow insert it into your HTML document that already exists. So a common way to do that is to find some element that you know exists already. So in this case, I'm targeting parent div, which is this div right here. Right, it's the outer div in this block. I'm saying, hey, get me the parent div, and I'm going to call this method. Again, this is one of the many methods that exist for elements. There's an append child method that lets you pass it an element. That's going to basically append an item here. New elements will be appended here. All right, so append child will say, all right, parent div, let's append a new child. Let's put it right here. I'm going to add a new button for functionality. So let's get that in here. Yeah, copy and paste. Add a new button for the break line. All right, so this new button is going to call another function. Instead of updating the color, it's going to call insert new element. Again, that's the function I've created. And notice my name, not a reserved name. And when we click this button, it should create a new div, give it this text, give it this class or these classes, and then append it into our parent div. So that's where we chose to put it. So let's actually check this out. Notice my new button here, insert new div. When I click it, I should get a new div added at the very bottom here. So I click insert new div. Notice I get a newly created div. I create as many as I want. Just keep appending. This can go on, as much as I want to. Let's get rid of our console for now. Just keeps adding it. Cool, nothing too exciting, but these are new divs that I'm constantly adding each time. All right, so it's pretty simple, again, to add new elements. This, again, increases our ability to make our pages dynamic so that we're not always confined to the elements that existed when we hard-coded our HTML page. We can add or remove elements based on our whim. Like whatever our page wants to do, we should have control over the DOM as we desire. Any questions on creating new elements? Andrew?
So when you added the new elements, the way that you changed a new element was to like go into the attribute and change that. Is there a way where you can just do it where you're adding like you're just writing the HTML for them to add in? I'm
not sure what you mean. Could you
like
clarify?
Because for new div, you write its Innerhtml. This
Yep.
is a newly created div,
Yep.
but it's really just the same as just writing the HTML on the other end.
Yeah, I could write it here. You're saying, yep.
My question is, in the JavaScript document, is there like a method or like a way to do it where you can actually just write it in HTML and it puts it in as HTML? Because this way, like I can see it confusing people because you're writing the JavaScript, but you're actually writing HTML still.
There's a way. So Innerhtml has more functionality that I'm letting on. For example, we could do something like, I think Innerhtml lets you write actual HTML. Right now, I'm creating elements and kind of working with elements, but you could write, I think, raw HTML here. So I could say paragraph. Let's put a paragraph in here instead and say replacing existing children. So this will be parsed as a paragraph. So it's not going to do anything with my new div, but let's see what happens here. So notice it replaced all those children. So what happened here, Innerhtml lets you actually modify actual HTML if you want to. So here, it actually took this and I effectively said, copy, delete all this, and now make the HTML inside of this parent div to be just a paragraph. Again, there are other ways. Innerhtml is not always preferred. There's, I think, inner text, I think, is a property where you, if you just want to set the text and not have it be parsed as HTML. In this case, it's actually honoring my paragraph tags. But if I want that just to be text, I think inner text, if I remember correctly, yeah, inner text is probably what we should be using. Innerhtml is a little overkill here, so maybe I should be using inner text, but it works the same for my needs right now. All right, can you get rid of that? I don't know if Andrew, did that answer your question? I don't know if I understood it.
Yeah, I think Ivan also said something like JSX makes it work with React too. Because
yeah, we'll get to React.
it's just like one of those things in my head. I'm like, why would you use JavaScript to just write the HTML? Like, because you can confuse yourself in ways, right?
Well, that's the thing.
Yeah.
This is dynamic. So again,
Yeah.
I could hard code it here, but how do I know how many new divs I need? Like the user's in control right here. We're saying, hey, I want 5 new divs. The user had control over that versus if we hard code it in, well, we're stuck with 3 divs or 5 divs. We can't change it, but JavaScript allows us to make that dynamic. Brendan?
Brendan, you're muted.
Yeah, Brendan, I don't think we can hear you.
Sorry, I thought I unmuted.
Happens.
So you're saying it's dynamic. Does that mean all these instances are created on the DOM? So if we looked at whatever the DOM file is, we would see them like pop up when we click the buttons?
Yeah, so here we are creating a new element. Here we are attaching it to the DOM. So parent div is a member of the DOM. So appending a child to parent div is going to add that child to the div. So we can actually inspect this. Again, our property inspector is really handy. If we go to the elements tab, this will show us what our HTML page looks like each time we're kind of modifying it. So if I could get some more space here. So notice this is what my HTML that I've sent, code injected by live server. That's okay, whatever. Notice I have 5 divs here. If I insert another one, notice a new one gets added here. So yes, our HTML is being updated each time. This is the DOM that's being updated.
So likewise, when you're adjusting the color and other attributes, it's just adjusting those on the DOM, which is modifying its pre-made CSS file?
Well, it is adjusting the CSS. So if I click red, notice everything with alpha class, because I think that's what I coded up, is going to be colored red or blue. We should be able to inspect the styles also. Styles down here. So let me bring that up. Can I click on something? Let's go to inspect elements. Notice it has the color added to it. So this is in the CSS. I set this color through JavaScript, but this is a CSS style that's been added for the element that I just selected here. So if I change it to red, this color should change. Notice now it's red.
Oh, that makes sense. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thank you for your question. All right, let's continue on. We got a few more things to go over. So again, adding new elements, definitely cool. That you can kind of manipulate the DOM dynamically and add or remove, as I mentioned, elements should you want to. All right, let's continue on. So we saw our example, so that's what we just did. As we said, there's many things you can update. So content, Innerhtml, we saw that source. So for example, if you have an image, you want to change the image that you're displaying, you have access through, if you have an image element, the SRC attribute is accessible to you because that's what the image object has. Now, not every element has the SRC attribute. It's only, specific elements have certain attributes. So we talked about style. We saw an example of that. We talked about creating elements. So just a review here. One thing I want to note here, CSS properties sometimes use hyphens, right? One example is background color, right? If you're writing just CSS, it's going to be background dash color, all lowercase. But if you want to access the style in JavaScript, dashes are not valid for variable names. So the convention is instead of using dashes, we convert to camel case. So background dash color becomes background uppercase C color to access it through JavaScript. That's how the properties are named. Just keep that in mind if you are messing with styling.
sorry, on that one, that's how the properties are named in the CSS file or in the JavaScript file that converts it automatically?
The DOM. So these are objects, so style is an object. Its property is going to be named background color. That's what the DOM, that's just what the naming convention is. But in CSS, yes, it would be background dash color if you're setting up just a CSS style yourself. All right, let's talk about events. So we already seen events before even talking about them, but again, a lot of us should be familiar with certain actions we could do, on a web page. We can click on things. So we click on a button. Our mouse moves across the web page. This is being tracked by the browser or by the window. So if we want to react to a mouse move, we have the option to. There's so many other events. Like these are just some common ones. Key down. So if like pressing a key on a web page, that can be detected, and we could kind of react to it if we want to. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. If you want to see a full list, we have a link on our curriculum page. We can take a gander at some of the events. So we talked about mouse events. So if the mouse is moving across an element versus if the mouse is down, as in if you're clicking a button, if you're moving away from an element, again, there's different mouse states. Also clicking, double clicking. Again, all the things you do with your keyboard and mouse, you probably would have an event for it. So key down is when you initially press a key. When you let go of a key, that's going to be a key up event. Pressing versus presses, I'm not sure how to distinguish between those, but there's a difference between a key down event and a key press event. But yeah, you can scan this page or Google for it. Again, there's a ton of events out there. We're not going to obviously cover all of them, but just know that there are ways to interact or respond to user actions with your web page. So let's kind of grab some examples off of our curriculum page, because that will make it a little easier to get this on screen. I'm going to drop in a modified version of insert new elements. Hopefully it won't kind of confuse you guys. Don't focus too much on details, but I'm using a new function called add event listener. All right, and then I'm specifying which event I actually care about. So again, we're creating a new div element just like before, giving it Innerhtml, giving it a class name. But now I want to add an event listener. So let's take a look at our kind of hard-coded HTML. We have event listeners set up here, right? We say for the on-click events or for the click event, this on-click event attribute is going to call our event listener. In this case, update color is going to be called. This is when we're hard-coding it in. But when we're creating a new element or just want to add new event listeners, we would call the add event listener, specify the event. So in this case, I want to say mouse move, and then do something in reaction to it. So again, I've done something a little more complicated here. Don't worry about understanding this, but my goal here is I want to track the mouse movement. So X is the X coordinate of the mouse. And I want to do something based on where the position is of that mouse. Additionally, I have another event listener for a different event, in this case, mouse out. So when the mouse leaves a particular element, we should reset the background color to whatever it was initially. So mouse move, I update the background color through some formula. Mouse leave, when the mouse leaves, I just reset the background color to what it was before. So with this code in place, let's take a look at now when we insert new elements, what behaviors they have, or what events they could react to. In this case, mouse move and mouse out. So I'm going to add some new divs. Now, if I actually, these first three don't have any mouse over events that we've decided to react to, so nothing's going to happen right now. If I go over like one of my new divs, notice it gets a background color. And I've made it so that when I move my mouse kind of horizontally, the X value or the X coordinate, that determines the actual color of the background. So if I go towards the left, I should get a wider background. If I go to the right, I get a deeper and deeper red. That's just the formula that I decided on. I mean, that's not the best example, but kind of highlights that the actual position of my mouse is impacting how we determine what to do with it. And this applies for every div that I have. So if I go to a new div, there's a new mouse move for this particular div. The other divs are not being signaled right now because the mouse is not moving over those elements. This event is happening for this particular element right here. Okay, so again, there's a lot of events you could hook into. Again, the list I showed you, you can react to key events, mouse events, other events that can happen on a page. But add event listener is kind of how you add those hooks in there. So you're saying, hey, This is the event that I want to spy on, and this is the function that should be called when that event happens. Now, the two things I want to point out, again, event listener takes in two parameters. The event name, so these names are specified. It's not something I've made up. These are predefined events named mouse move, mouse out, click is an event, drag is an event. You guys, again, can look them up, the names of them, but again, naming is kind of fragile, so if I make a typo here and say mouse out, capital O, that's not going to work like I want it to. The second parameter for add event listener is a function. Notice we're using fat arrow syntax here. Hopefully you guys aren't scared by fat arrow syntax. I'm basically creating a function on the spot right here that's going to be called only when the mouse out event happens, or here when the mouse move event happens. This function is taking in a parameter, and this is something I want to highlight here for events. We have access to an event object that has a wealth of information that we can use for our purposes. As we saw for my example above, I chose to use the X position of my mouse, and that is easily gotten by tapping into my event object and saying, hey, give me the X property of the mouse, or where the mouse was or is. Question is, well, what sort of items do we have access to? Well, you might have guessed it, or if you didn't, name of the game is reading documentation. So event object HTML should give me, all right, W3 schools, I'm a fan. There are methods that we can call on the event object, and also a lot of different properties. I guess this isn't the best example, so let me just actually print out the event object and let's actually see what's in there. So I'm gonna do print or console log, because this is JavaScript, EVT. Again, this is just a naming, a name I've given it. I can name this donuts, I can name this E, I can name it event. I name it EVT just because that's what I'm in the habit of. But this is going to be an event object with a lot of information. Let's take a look at actually what that information looks like. So again, anytime I mouse move, I'm going to get an event object and I'm going to print that out to the console. So let's bring up our terminal again. I want to look at the console and let's add some new divs. Now I'm going to do mouse move events. Notice every time I move, the mouse move handler or listener gets called, and I'm actually printing out the event that it receives. So if I look down here, I get a mouse event. That's the type of event that was received. If I expand that, I have a lot of information I can look at, client X, client Y. I can look at, again, I honestly don't look at most of these, but timestamp when this event happened. This is a time value that can be converted to minutes and seconds. It's also important often to know which element actually triggered this. So target is going to refer to the actual elements that this event stemmed off of. So notice I have 6 divs here. How do I know which particular div actually triggered this event? If event.target, target is a property that I can access. That's going to tell me exactly the div that was responsible for this event. In this case, notice the one that's highlighted. It's telling me that's the one that created this event. If I go over another div like this, and then I need to find that event. So we go to the very bottom. Again, a lot of events being generated. But now if I look at this one and go to target, target should now refer to the last div because that's the one that generated this. So if I click this, notice it's telling me the last div was the one that did it. So the event object knows specifically which element was the one that's generated the event. And we can use this as we need to. So we look at our code that we had here. I'm doing event.target. This is referring to the actual elements that that event spawned off of, and doing style.background color. So again, I'm using the same function for as many different divs that get created, but event.target is going to know which one is going to handle it. I guess that's not really true. I guess each div, I'm creating a new function for it, but I could optionally create a function here and call it update BG color. This might be a better example of this. So anytime we have functionality that can be reused, we can centralize that somewhere. So I'm just going to copy all this good stuff, put it into update BG color. And then here, my parameter is the name of the function. Again, I'm not calling the function, but update BG color, right? So same idea. I have a function that I want to be called. So this function will be called anytime any of my divs get called. Again, the reason I could do this because event.target is going to be different depending on which div generated the event. But it's going to be handled by the same function. So now if I can run this again, add a bunch of divs, I'm still going to get the same functionality, right? The red background gets brighter, dimmer, regardless of which div I'm over. Any questions about the event object? This is sort of magic. This is the browser doing this automatically. I am not passing the event in this case, right? I just create my event listener. I tell it which event I care about and which function will handle it. This value, the actual value that's passed my function, the browser is doing it. I am not doing it anywhere in my HTML or anywhere in my creation of this element. This event object is being passed automatically by the browser. And as I said, a lot of data that we can use based on what we need to do. Okay, a couple more examples, and then we'll wrap up here. So I'm going to drop in more code. Hopefully you guys aren't tired of more HTML code here, but let's create another group of divs just for this example. Add an HRs because I like horizontal rules. All right, let's take a look at, I guess this should replace what I had before. All right, so we have a similar structure here. We have a parent div. We have child divs, so 1, 2, and 3. Now I've added an on-click handler to 2 levels. My inner div here has an on-click and says, when we click on this, call our say hi function. So obviously this is something we need to code in. They're not going to be anything too glamorous, but I'm going to add these event listeners right here. Get rid of my console. All right, so these are my 2 event listeners, nothing too exciting. I'm just console logging either hi or hello based on which one gets called. So notice that my inner div right here on click is going to call my say hi event listener. But here I need to manually pass the events because I am directly calling this event listener. My browser is not automatically calling it, I am calling it. So in this case, I need to pass the event object if I want to use it. In this case, I am not using it here, right? I have event, but I'm not using it anywhere. So, I don't need to pass in this event. It's going to work the same. But if I, cared about like the X coordinate or the time this event happened or which element actually triggered it, then I would need to pass the event like so. Events here is a reserved keyword. It must be called EVENT lowercase. Again, this is much like how documents reserved keyword, event is a reserved keyword. So this is the value I'm passing in. The variable, I can name whatever I want. But a couple things I want to talk about here. Events actually propagate upward, meaning when I click on this particular div, this onClick is going to kind of catch it, and also this onClick, because we've said the parent div also wants to be notified of click events, and this div is a part of this larger div out here. So if I run this currently as is, both say hi and say hello will get fired if I click on this particular div. If I click on these 2 divs, only say hello will kind of fire. So let's actually check this out. So if I click on this one, I know it's not easy to see when I'm clicking, but I'm going to click right now. Notice I get 2 things in my console. I get hi and hello, because this first div specifically says when you click on me, call this function. But the parent div, which is kind of wrapping these smaller divs, also wants to handle the onClick event. So both of these handlers or event listeners got called. If I click on like 2 or 3, let's see what happens. If I click on second div, notice I only get hello down here. Maybe refresh to see this. If I click on the third div, hello gets printed out because this entire thing is the parent div, and these are individual divs within the parent div. Now, question is, well, what if I don't want both hi and hello to be called here, right? This is my inner div responding and the parent div responding. Well, one way we could do this is calling a particular method on our events. So here, again, this comes from reading documentation, but the event object has a method called stop propagation. Hopefully I spelled that correctly. This tells the DOM to stop passing up the event, meaning we're going to handle this event. Our parent will no longer get notified that this click event happened. So now with this event stop propagation, this event, when I click on the first div, notice it only says hi. It keeps saying hi. The parent div does not get a chance to handle the event because we've told it whatever our needs were. We don't want the parent handling this at all. Only this first div should handle it. But if I still click on my second or third div, they still go up to the parent because there's nothing kind of intercepting it saying, hey, let's stop this right here. So the parent still has a chance to handle these two click events, but this one that I'm clicking on only gets handled by the first div and not the parent. Questions? Andrew Tran.
Your on click, where it says yeah, your on click there, is that what is that? Is it an ID?
This isn't, so everything here, these are attributes. ID is an attribute, class is an attribute, on click is an attribute also. This is specifically known as an event attribute. So I think I have some slides on this. So we set up event listeners and event attributes. So the event attribute is the on click or on mouse move or on key down. And
Okay.
the event listener is the actual function that's going to handle that event. So these are reserved. These are not something that I made up. The click is an event, on click is an event attribute, and then do something in this case is my event listener. So depending on which event you want to kind of hook into, that's the event attribute you need to set up. You can Google event attributes, but they're going to kind of mirror the event names that exist. We talked about the event keywords. Just kind of go through our slides here. Again, event is a reserved keyword. So if you manually, again, looking at our example here, I am manually calling my event listener. So I need to manually pass it the event object. That's different than, for example, right here, where I add a new event listener and I say, all right, when the mouse moves, call update BG color. I'm requesting the browser to make this call for me. So in that case, the browser automatically passes that event object to my function. I do not have to do that manually. This is automatic because I'm not calling my event listener directly. This, I am calling my event listener directly. So I need to manually pass the event if I care about the event for my listener. Philip?
So the manual event that's being passed in is the on click.
Yes, in this case, this is the click event. So if I actually print that out, where is this? Say hi, let's print out event, console.log evt. That's the name I gave my event. If you console log that, let's take a look at what that looks like. So refresh, click this one. So it's called a pointer event. So previously we got a mouse event. This is a pointer event because we clicked. So I guess that's our pointer. Again, a whole list of data, where the X and Y value were, the time it happened. I'm sure it's in here. Should be timestamp. Yep. So this is when it happened. I don't know what actual value that is, but yeah. So the type of event was click. So again, our event object has a lot of information we could leverage should we need it. Okay, one more thing to go over. I know we're approaching lunchtime, but let's quickly go through it. So we talked about events. One thing we want to talk about that we're probably going to see a lot, especially when we're getting user input, is something called forms. So forms are an element type in HTML. They're, the way I would summarize it, they're just sections that you create within your HTML page to collect user input. You can actually collect, get values from controls without using a form, right? We saw you get element by ID, get the value out of various controls and use them as you wish. But forms to kind of make it easier because they kind of bundle data sets together. So this is an example of setting up a form. We'll create this in a moment, but basic highlights here is the form tag, opening and closing form tag. Within that, you add controls. A label is just a text field. An input is a text input, so where we actually want to capture user, something the user typing in. And this important thing is you must have some type of submit control to tell your form that you're actually submitting data. So in this case, we have a button with type submit so that the form knows that when you actually click this button, it's going to proceed with the submit handler. So the form has an onSubmit event attribute, meaning when it receives a submit event, we can react to it and do whatever we want with that data. So we do have an example on our curriculum page. I'm just going to quickly go through that, and then we can call it lunch. So I'm going to replace what we had before. So here, this is not a form. This is just an input and a button. it works, but let's actually convert that to a form. So I'm going to copy and paste from the curriculum page. So here, I'm going to make this a form now. So this is our form. Notice it looks very similar. We have some additional items that we kind of added in here. So I want to point those out. So the form has an onSubmit event attribute. So when we actually click the submit button, we're going to call our handler. So in this case, handle form submit is what I chose to call it. Some other things I want to point out. So we have an input field. There's a name attribute that you should give every single field within a form. This is different than the ID field. They are very similar, but name is used to kind of know which field you're talking about within the form context. ID can still be used if you want to do like get element by ID, but name is going to have some different functionality for form elements. So in this case, I have an element called input name, I have another element called favorite color, and then a button to submit that data to our form. So I'm going to copy some more code. Hopefully you guys are fine with all this copy and pasting. But again, all this code is on our curriculum page, should you want to refer to it later. But I'm going to replace my show greeting with something new. All right, so let's take a look at what I've copied and pasted here. So my handle form submit, again, this is an event listener that I'm going to call from my onSubmit event. So this will get past an event. We are calling another event method. So previously we called stop propagation. This tells the DOM to stop passing the event to other elements. Prevent default is similar, but it actually tells the browser to not handle this in the default manner that it might. So in this case, we're saying, hey, we're going to handle this ourselves. Browser, don't do anything that you normally would do. With form processing, the default behavior for your browser is to refresh the page. In this case, we don't want to refresh our page, so prevent default is going to prevent that default behavior. There are other default behaviors we could see in a second, but I just want to show you how we could process form data. And this makes it a little easier rather than having individual elements on our page. Our form kind of bundles those together. So using this form data object, I can create a form data instance and then go over all the fields within it. So again, some of the syntax is going to be kind of new. Apologies for kind of rushing through this, but I create a form data instance. I call object.form entries to get the properties, and then I can iterate over those properties and print out, the data that the user inputted. So here I'm collecting the user's name and favorite color, and I'm passing their name to our new show greeting function. Let's take a look at this. Name is Bill Gates. Favorite color, I think, is, I don't know, blue. So I submit. Field is not defined. Typo there. Should be field name. So let's try that again.
You forgot to put submit in quotes on line 13 in your HTML.
13. Oh, yes. Yes. Thank you. Good catch. Good catch. Yes, that needs to be type submits in quotes, not some weird syntax I had. Thanks for catching that. So I do Bill Gates. Color is blue. Submit. Notice what gets outputted here. I'm collecting that data and displaying it right now. Normally, from a form, you will take the data and maybe send it off to a server. So like if I'm logging in, for example, I type in my username and password, hit login, and that's going to take whatever I type for my username and password, pass it over to a server, and the server's be like, all right, yep, this is your username and password combination that checks out. Probably let's kind of validate you and let you access our site. But right now I'm just displaying values in my console, nothing too exciting. But notice my favorite color is blue. The name is Bill Gates. These are the actual name attributes that I gave. So just to highlight those, name and fave color, those are the name attributes I specified. So that's again, forms care more about the name. The IDs aren't really used. I'm not sure why, but name is the actual thing that's the identifier within a form. So as I'm looping through this, field name is the name, either name or fave color, and then form data.get, I pass it the field name that I want to get the value for, and it spits out the actual value that the user inputted. This is one way to work with form data. Maybe not the most common way you might see. So just to give you a full detail in here, an alternate way, it's a little more manual. I prefer the form data method, but if you're like, hey, I don't know what form data is, I don't want to work with this object, that's cool. You don't have to. Again, we can use event.target, which will tell you, the specific form that generated this event. in this case, the submit event. And we could just extract elements kind of through an array. So dot elements is going to be an ordered array. So the first element is going to be my name input. The second one is going to be my favorite color input. The third one would be my submit button, if I, for some reason, cared about my submit button. In this case, I'm accessing them kind of through an array, and I can still get to the name of the elements and the value contained within there. So this should not change anything from my previous functionality. It's just a different way to access your form data. So if I ran this again, let's go with Bill Gates. And let's say he likes red this time. I submit form data not defined, right? Because I change that up. So this should be name element dot value. All right, so show greeting is taking in a name value and greeting the person. So let's do that one more time without errors, hopefully. Bill Gates likes red. Submit. We still got the form data. So again, we're gonna be working with forms much more when we're developing like websites that have login pages or want to like add new data. Forms are like the default way to kind of collect data from the user, bundle it up and send it off or do whatever we need to do with it. Just to highlight prevent default, if I did not have this prevent default here, as I mentioned, the default behavior for a form submit is to refresh the page. So if I actually did, type in Bill Gates and let's say his favorite color is now pink, if I hit submit, notice that my entire page refreshed. I lost everything that just kind of got inserted into my console. My page is reset. It's back to square one, as if I just loaded this page. I did get something in my URL though. This is something related to the method I'm using. So in this case, I did a get method. So it's going to kind of append that data to my URL. We'll talk more about form processing, I think, later as we get more involved with it. I don't think we're going to be dealing with forms for our challenges today. I mean, I guess you could use a form for one of the challenges. I'll take that back. But all right, so that's forms. Again, prevent default just prevents default behavior. Spacebar. So if I actually add a bunch of these divs, most browsers, if you hit spacebar, so we hit spacebar right here. Right here, it scrolls the page. That's again default behavior that your browser automatically does. It detects a spacebar being pressed, and it's going to scroll for us. So just do that again. We hit spacebar. Notice it scrolls. What if I didn't want to do that? How can I prevent that from happening? Again, event.prevent default can do that for us. So if we wanted to see example of that, I think I could quickly code that up, and then I'll let you get to launcher comments. How do you want to do this? So we want to detect the key down events and then prevent that from happening. So I'm going to sneak in some code. Apologies, this is not on our curriculum page, but I just want to show you an example. So the window, I'm going to add an event listener to the window. So that's what our browser is. I'm going to say when a key down event happens, let me try to determine what type of key is being pressed. If it's specifically the spacebar key, so event.code is going to be telling you what key got pressed. In this case, space is the name of the spacebar key. I'm going to say, let's not do the default event. So in this case, normally when I hit spacebar, my page scrolls. Adding this event listener, the key down is going to say, all right, let's intercept it and just don't allow the browser to do what it normally would do. So with this in place, let's go back to our page, add a bunch of divs. I want to get scroll functionality. All right, so if I go back to my main window here, hit spacebar, nothing happens. I'm hitting this 20 times. I guess you guys can't see what I'm hitting, but I'm honestly hitting my spacebar. This isn't scrolling because we've told our event that we don't want the browser to handle it. We want to just kind of end it right here. So again, a lot to learn about the event object. We touched the tip of the iceberg. There's again a lot of information in there. Some useful methods. We talked about prevent default, stop propagation. I think we saw earlier. To kind of understand, stop propagation says, hey, don't pass this to any other element on the page. Prevent default says, don't pass it to the browser to kind of do whatever the browser wants to do. Okie dokes. Thanks for seeing through all that. Any questions about events or forms? So just to wrap up our slides, nothing too exciting. So we talked about how to work with form data. Again, there's a form data class we can use where we pass it to the event and we extract data that way. Or you can just do it manually by doing event.target.elements and then kind of using that array to get each each element's array or elements value out of there. All right, just to wrap up here, understand on a high level what the DOM is. Again, just understand that is the main kind of interface between your HTML file and your JavaScript file. It gives you an object representation of your HTML document so that your JavaScript can interact with those elements. We talked about including JavaScript within your HTML document. Just to review, we use the script tag. So just to highlight that, again, this is generally the way you'll do it. You'll put in your head section in your HTML document, script tag, tell it where the file is located, and then usually want to defer it, as in load the file after all your elements have loaded into the DOM. So that's how we get our HTML and JavaScript kind of linked up. Understand how to access elements. We talked about methods like get element by ID, get element by class name, get element or query selector all. These are common methods you'll use to access your DOM. You can also create elements. We looked at the create element function, aptly named, to add new elements to our DOM. So again, you can manipulate the DOM with JavaScript. That's the main takeaway here. That gives us the ability to make our pages more dynamic rather than just having a hard-coded HTML file that we're kind of stuck with. And then finally, we talked about events. Again, there's a whole list of events that can happen. Typical ones are clicking on something, moving your mouse, typing something, leaving a control. That's focus and unfocus, or blurring is the term for that. But understand that we can hook into these events, specify an event listener, and then react to the events which way we want. We also have an event object that has data that we can use, like the control that triggered the event, the position of the mouse, the time the event happened, a lot of things that can allow us to do what we want. And then we briefly talked about at the very end, form data. I know that's kind of rushed, but we will see forms more in the future. So forms aren't going to go away. We'll see how we can work with collecting user data and how we actually pass that along to like a server once we talk about web servers and other items in that list. Okay, what questions do you guys have about any of the topics we covered today?
On the script tag, what does the defer specifically do?
Yeah, so again, the defer, I think I had a slide for that. That's going to wait for your document to fully load before your script kind of starts executing. So it's going to say, hey, usually, not usually, but your JavaScript might refer to particular elements in your documents. For example, in my code, I have JavaScript here that, like, when I move a mouse over a control, I don't know the best way to show this. I guess I have update color. This is saying get everything that has a class name alpha and update its color. Well, if somehow this update color function got fired initially when we loaded our JavaScript, it's not going to detect anyone that has a class alpha because all these elements have not been loaded yet. So defer says let everything in your body load into the DOM, and then we will run our JavaScript after that point.
Is there ever an instance where you don't want it to load everything first?
Yeah, it's possible. If you really need to like do something before your paging loads, yeah, you can have your JavaScript execute right away. Again, it comes down to your use case. Most of the times you probably want to defer, but if you really, really, really need to do something like right away, then yeah, you can not have a defer and it'll work as you want it to. All right, Andrew.
Yeah, I'm just having a hard time wrapping my head around like the DOM and the JavaScript interaction.
Okay.
Is it, tell me if I'm saying this right. It's almost as if like the functions inside the JavaScript thing are like, they're almost like class methods that you can call upon in your HTML document.
Almost. So again, we're not putting the coding in our HTML document, but yes, the DOM is an object-oriented representation of your HTML document. So again, terminology there is important. Again, OOP, we studied that a couple weeks ago. It's not going to go away. The good thing here is we're not creating our own classes. The DOM is doing that for us. So the DOM has an element class that it creates instances for. So there's an element class. It's a concept that exists out there. The DOM goes through our HTML document and says, all right, we need to create an element. We need to create a button element. So I'm going to create an instance of the button class. So there's a class, there's an object representation of a class that's already coded for us. We're not creating it. We're just creating an instance of it, and the DOM handles all that legwork for us. So we don't have to worry about creating classes, creating instances. That's done automatically for us through the DOM creation, and our browser is the one that's actually doing the work for us. Yes, we are working with classes and instances. So again, another example of OOP, but in this case, we're not designing classes. We're just kind of using classes that or even have been created for us.
So Ankur, I got a question. It's not about today's curriculum, but on the assessments, whenever we get the results from assessment 2 back, are we actually gonna get the rubric as far as what areas we were dinged on rather than just a final grade?
Yeah, so if you do desire more detail, I definitely, when I'm grading, I take notes. So, if you failed a test case that I ran or like had some, deductions for styling or not writing dry code, I usually note that down. So if you do want to discuss your assessment 1s or assessment 2s when you get them back, usually we'll have some additional notes. We don't always provide them up front, but if you're like, hey, why did I get, lose a couple points here? If you're curious, again, I want to reiterate, I'm actually going to stop the recording here.